Hi, everybody. Before we get to another great interview, the Too Opinionated podcast could really use your help. And it's easy, it's free. IMDb, which is the entertainment database, imdb.com, named us a top 100 podcast. We came in at number 82. That's a big deal because there's 15 million podcasts and growing. So to be named to anybody's top 100 list, pretty big deal for us. And the way you can help is to go to imdb.com, look up the Too Opinionated podcast, and that's it. Just bringing our page up. That traffic really helps us out. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. All we ask is that you subscribe. It's also free, but that really helps us to attract these amazing guests that we keep bringing on the program. And that's it. 2 easy ways for you to support us, and we would really appreciate the help. Now let's get to that interview. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Too Opinionated. I'm so excited today. I've got writer, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Dan Luzadder with me. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk with you, and I know we've got a couple of books to talk about, but let's start this way. Let's introduce you a little bit. Tell me what got you into journalism.
Well, I flunked English when I was a sophomore in high school, and I wound up with a tutor who said I was too thick-headed to teach grammar, so she taught me how to write rhythmically, and the only job I could find to do that was in newspapers. So I wound up as a teenage police reporter for a gritty little daily newspaper when back in the days when they still had hot type, they still had linotype machines, and people processed stories on typewriters and copy paper a long time ago. But I kind of got hooked on journalism from the police beat, from being out there on the street, looking to see what was happening to people, and writing about those kinds of events, and then the adrenaline of all of that just kind of kept me focused on journalism for a very long career.
Where'd you grow up at?
I grew up in Indiana, in Middletown, USA, Muncie, Indiana. It was made famous by a famous study on we were the most average people in America, I guess. So, but it was a blue collar town, a lot of auto parts manufacturing and that kind of stuff. And it was vigorous, and it certainly had an interesting street life. So that was what got me interested.
Well, I saw you spent some time in Fort Wayne. My daughter works with Asher Agency, and they're based out of Fort Wayne, so she travels there quite a bit. I've never been there myself, but she drives down there. It's about a 4-hour drive from where we're at.
I graduated from college and decided I'd take a few months off. And then at the time there was a recession. There were no newspaper jobs. So I wound up working with a crew of Amish carpenters for about 6 months, learning how to frame houses. But when
you probably learned a lot.
I did. I learned a lot from working with them. That was for sure, especially about hard work.
Yeah.
But when I did finally find a job in Fort Wayne on the News Sentinel, it was on the copy desk. And so I went on board on the copy desk, and I wasn't the greatest speller in the world, and copy editing wasn't my forte. But after about 8 months, the editor called me into his office, and he said, close the door. He said, I want to tell you, you're the worst copy editor I ever hired. I said, I keep my dictionary close by. I check everything. He said, it's not that. He said, you rewrite everybody's copy so it sounds like you. He said, I got 34 reporters out there. I'd like them to sound like themselves. I said, well, so am I fired? He said, well, no, you're our new columnist. And so I spent the next 7 years writing columns there in Fort Wayne about just pretty much anything I wanted to write about. And some of those are collected in this book that was just released, Street Talk. Some of those columns from those days, including the Pulitzer material from the Fort Wayne News Sentinel.
Yeah, that's a pretty great. And a lot of us kind of have those stories where you're doing something that's kind of adjacent to what you end up spending most of your life doing, but you're not great at it. And then somebody out for whatever reason, whether it's a pity or whatever, they kind of nudge you into what ends up being your actual career.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was an interesting uptake. I called the column Street Talk. I didn't have any sources out there. I was coming off the copy desk, and I sort of imagined what the column would be like. But after a while, I did develop those kinds of sources and street level people that were in the know about things, and I learned a lot. And I wrote some pretty hard hitting columns, and that got me into covering state prisons and
Yeah.
writing about human rights issues and that sort of thing. And then I moved on to investigative reporting, where you could have a little more punch than you could have as a columnist. So
You're right. What do you think about like I'm my dad and my dad was a principal, a school administrator, but to make ends meet, he ran a paper route. And so
uh,
I started as soon as I could drive. I was his backup, and then eventually I got my own routes and did that. And I've always had that kind of connection with a newspaper, but they're dying off. Our local newspaper, it went to 6 days. Now it's down to 5. Now it's coming by mail because we don't have enough people subscribing, so they don't want to pay a carrier. Now, just
right.
what do you think about where we're going as far as having to move to like online content as opposed to holding it in our hands?
Well, I was also a newspaper boy from the time I was 11, delivering the paper that I later worked for, and as a reporter. There have been tremendous changes in journalism and the newspaper industry, and we see the demise of papers. The paper I worked for in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News, 150 years old,
Yeah.
closed down and gone. The Denver Post is the last remaining major newspaper in the area, in the metropolitan area. We've seen this all over the country, and big newspapers and small newspapers. Just, I paid a visit to the Astoria newspaper when I moved out to the coast, and spent a little time talking to the editor. And the thing that struck me the most was I walked into the newsroom, what had been the newsroom of the Astoria newspaper, and there was nobody there. The reporters were working from home. They were making their phone calls. They were not down at City Hall, or at least apparently to me.
Yeah.
They were not out on the police beat. That's something that has been lost as newspapers have declined. There was an institution for reporting. It was learn on the job, mentoring. Older reporters taught younger reporters who to go to. They slipped a piece of paper on your desk with the name of a source when they heard you talking about a story, somebody to call. They carried you a long way. The newsrooms of old were very lively places and very entertaining, full of characters. And it wasn't exactly Damon Runyon, but there were a good number of characters, and there was a vibrancy to that. So that is gone mostly as newspapers have cut back because of financial issues. They've hired younger staffs, and older reporters have gotten laid off. They've gone on to try to find other things. A lot of them trying to survive on freelance or other kinds of things, or monetize what they can do, which is very difficult.
Yeah.
And and so we see that institution of reporting, that network of source building and knowing the community. We see that disappear, and we don't really feel it. We don't understand it until we see the impact, which is we're no longer keeping the history, the ongoing record of our daily lives the way we used to when newspapers were available, dating back to their beginnings, and their libraries kept their stories, and you could go back and look for that information. Now we're losing bits and pieces of our history because that reporting network doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to bring this up because I think it ties into your other book, and we'll get back to Street Talk because I definitely want to talk about that. But your other book, The Manchurian Journalist, part of what I've noticed is that a lot of our newspaper reporters were who covered our local governments. So
Right.
those we don't have that many reporters anymore, and we definitely don't have the guys that covered back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. They're retired or let go or gone. Do you think that contributes to the lack of accountability that our elected officials have? Because we don't have those people in place that are questioning what they're doing.
Exactly. I absolutely agree with it. I think it happens everywhere, every day. You know, the when in the old days, when you worked police beat, you visited what we called traps. You went down to the sheriff's office and you stopped in and talked to the dispatcher. You went to the main firehouse and you talked to the dispatcher there, and you asked them questions about what was going on, what were they hearing, and you also talked to them about their kids, and you also talked to them about their lives, and you also talked about your own, and you got to know them and you developed relationships. Those and they expected you to be there. And when you went to the clerk's office and asked for the accident reports, they just handed them across the counter to you so you could go through and take a look at what the facts
Right.
were, make your notes. Well, now if you want access to a police report as a reporter, for a small town newspaper, you may have to make a request to the public affairs officer or something else. Nobody else will talk to you. You don't get to know the cop on the beach. You don't get to know the police chief. You don't get to know those people so that you can call them up at home in the middle of the night and say, what the hell is going on?
Right. Right. Yeah,
And
I
it,
miss those days.
yeah,
We all kind of grew up with Walter Cronkite, Ted Koppel, that group of television reporters, and then you had your newspaper reporters. But those were people that you felt that you could trust. You were invested in them as journalists, and you felt like they were going to tell you what was happening unbiased.
right.
That's not really the case anymore.
There was also a mechanism for reacting to that. When we hear broadcast or things on the air that we don't really have a record of, we can go back and see a recording and see what's going on. But when things were reported in the newspaper and somebody who had familiarity with that story saw something that was inaccurate, they picked up the phone and called the editor and said, "Hey, this is wrong." And there was either a correction or clarification or something else that was done. And so you could keep track of the record. You could keep track of what the accurate story was. Well, I'm kind of finding it difficult to go back and track what the record is when I'm looking at national news and this is reported or that is reported.
Right.
Is that what I heard? Is that what they said? Is that what, and it's tough to go back and find it again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
systems have changed.
Yeah, they really have. I wanted to ask your opinion of our presidential debate, and not the performances. My curiosity was more, we had maybe some untruths, some outright lies maybe told, and to me, I was surprised that the moderators, who are journalists, didn't pause and correct that when those incidents happened. Why wouldn't you just kind of correct that and follow up on those lines? It would have been an entirely different debate, but I just curious what you thought about that.
Well, I agree that when mistruths or untruths are being positioned, it's incumbent upon the person that's doing the interviews or conducting the debates to flag it and raise a question about it, even if you don't get the answer that you're looking for, or don't define or finally resolve what that issue is. At least you've raised it
Yeah, you've
and
called it out at least.
called it out, and that has to be done. We have so much misinformation and disinformation going on now. It's become worse than I think it has ever been, and so we don't really know at this point where to go to find out what is exactly true. There's you can go online and look for fact checkers, and you can do that, or you can spend the time yourself tracking down the information. I was, interestingly enough, I found myself looking at immigration figures yesterday in the wake of the Republican National Convention
Yeah.
and the speeches that were being made, to look and see whether or not the influx that they were talking about of undocumented individuals was as described, and I didn't find it to be the same as what I found from what appeared to be reliable sources. The information was not different, but there was no calling out of that particular thing. There were called out on news programs on other issues, but
Right.
not
Right.
that.
Yeah. Just kind of disheartening, I
Yeah.
think, because a lot of people, those debates, especially, that's kind of their, that's when they get kind of interested or pay attention to the presidential election.
Mhm.
So what's being said there is kind of, they take that as truth if nobody else calls it out. I just, yeah, I don't know. It seems strange to me. I've watched a lot of those debates in my life, and that's the first one I ever remember that didn't actually call out when something was obviously wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Something else I've noticed that I think is interesting is that in the wake of the assassination attempt, it seemed to me from watching stations on both sides that there was a pullback from the antagonism that had been so vehement on both
Yeah.
sides, toward Biden and toward Trump. The As if reporters were stepping back and taking a look at how far they had gone, and hesitating. I don't know if it was just my perception
I mean,
or
that
if,
could be a good thing.
yeah, well, exactly, it could be because I think there has been so much excess, and we treat commentary like news, and we polarize to line up with what we believe or want to believe, instead of sitting back and looking at the facts and trying to figure out what it means. I find MSNBC entertaining and interesting, and and there's some value there. I find some reporting on Fox is sometimes more accurate than reporting
Sure.
elsewhere, and oftentimes not. And the dichotomy there is interesting, but it's not the kind of journalism that I'm familiar with, nor that I think is of real value to democracy. We need something that's a little more solid
Yeah.
and well documented information. That's what I think gives us confidence in what's credible and what's not.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I could definitely see a difference in the coverage from this assassination attempt and say Reagan getting shot. I remember that, them wheeling the TVs into the schoolrooms, so that we could watch what was occurring, but it was a little different this time. And I did sense some of that pulling back, and you definitely heard a lot of talk about scaling things down, that type of thing. But there was also some spin coming from both sides, and that surprised me. That was different from what we'd seen in the past.
I also thought it was interesting that in the wake of the assassination attempt, you went to primary channels on television. Jeopardy was still playing instead of being preempted by what
Yeah,
was going on, and I thought it reflected something that is distressing, in that has violence become political violence and other violence become so common in our culture now that an assassination attempt of the former president can't preempt Jeopardy.
yeah,
I
kind of scary.
I think it is, and it's interesting to see how quickly we've moved on to other things and other discussions. There's reporting going on what happened and the failures of security that
Yeah,
existed that allowed for something like that, but at the same time, it doesn't feel the same. Uh,
yeah,
you know, I covered Columbine. I covered the police investigation and was inside that investigation on the case, and the violence that occurred there left a permanent,
yeah,
scar on many people. And then we watched as that kind of thing continued for 2 decades,
yeah.
with us becoming desensitized, I think, to these kinds of things. And is that reflected in how we're covering this
Well, it
assassination?
probably is.
Yeah.
I didn't realize, like, it didn't dawn on me, but you're exactly right. In the past when that happened, that's all that was on every
Exactly.
channel all day long.
Exactly. I was a sophomore in high school, in that in the English class I flunked when I was there, when Kennedy was shot, and I remember very well, the next 3 days being glued to the television constantly, the entire family watching what was
Yeah.
unfolding as it was covered. Yeah.
Well, and even, in this obviously much larger scale, but when 9/11 happened, same thing. I mean, it was nonstop coverage on every channel, and we were all glued to it. And
Yeah,
somewhere over the last, especially the last decade, we've kind of lost that. Now you have to go look for the news a little bit.
that's right.
Yeah.
I was working for a magazine out of New York when 9/11 happened, and the disruptions that occurred, and the changes in all our lives. The magazine ended up folding. It was just 2 dozen blocks from the World
Yeah.
Trade Center. And we continued to report and on that thoroughly for years, really.
Yeah.
And the impact politically of what's happened with this most recent assassination attempt is going to have an impact for years, but I
I
don't
think so.
think we're going to follow it or report on it in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. So the book you have out currently, let me make sure I get this right. The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence
Right.
Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism.
Yes.
So that one came out last month.
Right.
It's out there everywhere now. So I guess my first question is explain to us who Lawrence Wright is.
All right. Well, Lawrence Wright is a writer of long standing. He's a
Mm-hmm.
correspondent for the New Yorker, which is kind of the pinnacle for journalists and writers in our literary culture.
Yeah.
Um, he is a filmmaker. He was a screenwriter of a movie called The Siege, which starred Denzel Washington and Annette Bening, and was about terror in New York City a couple of years before 9/11.
Yeah.
He's written a lot of books, and one of them was his investigation into Al Qaeda, Looming Tower,
Remember
um,
that? Yeah.
which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2007 for reporting. He also did a book called Going Clear, which is and a documentary, both on the Church of Scientology, and that is in part how I became interested in Lawrence Wright and his history as a journalist, because I was freelancing at the time. The Church of Scientology was relaunching a magazine that they had produced for some time called Freedom Magazine,
Yeah.
and through another reporter, I was introduced to them. They were looking for someone who had extensive investigative experience, and and they asked me on a freelance basis if I would look into the media coverage of the church and whether or not it was fair, or, as they contended, completely biased. So I did that, and I took a look at it, and I found some problematic areas with the reporting and coverage of the church, and some of the things that they were contending I found were not being covered or reported.
Yeah.
Lawrence Wright did a story in the New Yorker about a film director, Paul Haggis, who had been a Scientologist and defected, and he did a piece in the New Yorker, and then he turned that into a book on the church, which was billed as investigative, and it was billed as the definitive investigative story of the Church of Scientology. But when I took a look at the book and the film that was done by Alex Gibney, the well-known documentarian, um, I found that there were some shortcuts taken in the story and some things that were repeated that had been published before by sources that were not particularly reliable.
Right.
But I went beyond that, and I began to look at Lawrence Wright himself, and I wanted to know, given his reputation and the high praise he'd received as an investigative reporter, how he had gotten to where he was. And so I bought all his books and I read them, and I paid a particular attention to a memoir that he wrote when he was in his 30s. And it stemmed from a magazine story he had written for Texas Monthly, which is a great magazine and a cultural star in journalism, sort
Yeah.
of like the New Yorker. And as I began to examine this memoir and the story he told, I just pulled it apart the way I would any other investigative piece. I tested what looked like it was true, what looked like it might not be true, whether or not the timelines fit,
Right.
and the story he was telling. And I found something more interesting than anything pertaining to the Church of Scientology and his coverage of it. And that was that he had told a story about growing up in Dallas in the era when Kennedy was assassinated. His father had taken a job at a little storefront bank in a shopping mall. He was president of this little bank, and Wright told the story in his memoir about his father's history as a military man and how they had conflicted during the Vietnam War. And Wright had determined that he was a conscientious objector and he wanted to be exempted on that basis. And so in his memoir, the story he told was that he managed to convince the Dallas Draft Board on the strength of an essay that he wrote about his conscientious objection to exempt him from service. So I pulled that apart and I talked to a lot of conscientious objectors who had been granted that status and some people who had applied and not been granted status. And they described a much different circumstance.
Right.
That process was one in which you brought witnesses, when you gave documentation. It wasn't easy to become a conscientious objector,
Yeah,
but
I'm sure, because a lot more would have done it.
Wright wrote about having a fight with his father over patriotism and that, and he left and decided he would go to a little summer class at Radcliffe College on publishing, the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course. And while he was there, he got confirmation of his CO status, and he needed a job, alternative service, which you were required to do 2 years of service if you were granted that status. He didn't want to stay in the US. He wanted a job out of the country. So he caught a bus down to the United Nations and asked around to see if he could find a job. And some helpful person gave him a list of nonprofits. The first one was on the list was the American University in Cairo. And he walked down the street. They happened to have an office nearby. He walked in. They were desperately looking for teachers teaching English that would
Yeah.
qualify under the thing. And so they wanted to put him on a plane that day. They were so desperate for teachers. And instead, he caught the bus back to Boston and then came back. He rode and flew from JFK to Cairo and started that process. So I did a careful examination of all that story.
Yeah.
What I found was that getting into the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course wasn't easy. They actually recruited people for that course, about 60 people a year. And the person who ran that course, Helen Venn, she was recruiting these people for all over the country, and she had a 96% placement rate in the publishing
Oh,
industry
wow.
for people who graduated from this 6 weeks course. Well, as I pursued it further, it turned out Helen Venn was connected to the State Department. She was connected to something called Franklin Books, which was a propaganda program put together by the State Department and the CIA.
It's
She,
kind of crazy that this story just keeps getting weirder and bigger.
yeah, and it did, and it amazed me. And so when I got to pulling apart Lawrence Wright's description of the timeline of his visit to the United Nations, I discovered that the story didn't hold together. So I took it a step farther and I hired a guy in Cairo to go down to the American University and pull Lawrence Wright's student records. And the archivist waived the 50-year rule and gave him the records. And it turned out that as I pursued the information, that the university was not desperate for teachers. And that even to the point of his description of flying from JFK to Cairo didn't work, because I called the TWA museum and talked to a woman who was very familiar with flights to Cairo back then. And no two flights, you couldn't get a direct flight to Cairo on the day he described. So it turned out
What
that,
does all that mean though? Why
well,
make that story up?
why make it up? And that's what my conclusion was in the book, that this was something of a cover story, because not only was Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course linked to the CIA, but the American University in Cairo was as well. It was an outpost for teaching English as a foreign language, a cultural approach in the Middle East to try to develop friends and contacts. And ironically, the person who helped design that program was the guy that hired Lawrence Wright's father at this little storefront bank in Texas, Robert Story. And Robert Story was head of the American Bar Association, head of the International Bar Association, chief executive trial prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials.
Wow.
But Lawrence Wright never mentioned this famous person in connection with his family in all the books
That
he's written.
seems strange.
It seemed a little strange. And as I looked further, it became clear to me that this recruiting and propaganda program that was run by an intelligence network, not just the CIA, but their friends throughout the media, throughout other parts of our culture, our entertainment media, from Hollywood to magazines to newspapers to book publishing, that this network groomed and brought people in who were sympathetic to Western cultural ideas and subsequently pop anti-communist propaganda in the wake of the Cold War. And that's what the Manchurian journalist delves into.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because what you're saying kind of is that you've got a group of people that is using the media, entertainment, all of that as a propaganda outlet.
Exactly. And Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame wrote a story for a Rolling Stone magazine back in the 70s about Operation Mockingbird, which was a CIA program to recruit journalists, and talked about some very famous American journalists who were definitely on the CIA payroll, and about some 400 other journalists in the country who were either wittingly or unwittingly participating with State Department and CIA intelligence gathering operations. And that became something of a scandal in the 70s. There were congressional hearings into the use of journalists and priests and academians as fronts for things. But the tie into Lawrence Wright became more apparent when I discovered that Robert Story's close friend and associate, Carl Hablitzel, who became a multimillionaire in the movie theater business and then in oil and gas in Dallas. He was also head of the Hablitzel Foundation, which had provided $500 million as a front to fund these propaganda operations around the world on behalf of the CIA. And
I mean, it sounds like a story that like a movie you would watch or a book that you would read. It doesn't sound real.
it doesn't sound real. And so I had to ask myself over those 5 years that I was putting this story together, can this be real? Can it be true? But when you pursue the facts, when you pursue documentation, and the book is pretty thoroughly documented, the conclusions leap to the fore and are unavoidable. That the book refers to Wright's memoir as a cover story, and indeed, in the sense that it explained how he became involved in journalism, it misleads because it fails to mention those other things that played a part in his rise in the journalistic world. He's a very influential journalist.
Yeah.
He's interviewed on national television. Bob Schaefer on I think it was Meet the Press after he wrote his book on Al Qaeda introduced him as the most knowledgeable Western man on Al Qaeda. And I found that pretty incredible, given the intelligence officers that I've known over the years, who I think would think that there's probably more intelligence material in the hands of the agency and those agencies than is in the hands of any journalist.
Well, and if that's the case with him, then logically, you would think that that's probably the case with a lot of people that you don't know.
And I think that's an interesting question, and one that we need to know more about. The book concludes by asking about this very thing. Lawrence Wright, I approached him on a number of occasions and tried to get him to talk to me about these things, and he refused. Instead, he posted something on Twitter that said that I was not a reporter. If I contacted any of his friends, they should know I was not a reporter, but I was a private investigator hired by the Church of Scientology to stalk and harass him.
I was wondering how that tied in, but you explained that because that's how the story kind of starts. It just
Yes.
led you down this rabbit hole.
Right. And I had already had communication with Wright. We'd traded emails. I had asked him for the opportunity to talk to him about the contention by the church about the errors in his book.
Yeah.
And I went to his a performance of his band. I took a copy of his book, and this was after I had already traded emails with him, and I asked him to sign it, and I asked him to talk to me about it then. And before I published this book, I sent him a letter in detail, all of the matters that I intended to report, and ask him to respond, but he didn't. The I wish he had, and I wish he would, because I think it would be valuable for us to know. What is the explanation behind this?
Well, right. Is it like, is he involved willingly? Is it something that he just was kind of forced into? That would be my question.
Well, there were a lot of reporters, I think, that were used unwittingly for information by intelligence sources. And as someone who I've done undercover investigations, I investigated drug trafficking in state prisons, and I was undercover on that. And some people don't think that's an appropriate thing for a reporter to do, but sometimes that's the only way you find things
Sure.
out, is that you get inside, or you get as close as you can. But you have to be truthful about that. You have to say. And so, did Wright simply grow up sympathetic to a certain perspective and an idea about America? He certainly, in his memoir, talked about how disgusted he was with the culture of the country and the Vietnam War
Right.
and all of that. Um, did he have help from the CIA? Every reporter in the world wants the best sources possible. You want to develop those sources that are the most accurate, and to reach into those places, but it isn't easy. If I freelanced for the New York Times, and when I called someone for an interview, when I was representing the New York Times, I got right through.
Right.
And when you call somebody and you say you're from the New Yorker magazine, you get right through.
Right.
But if you call and say I'm a freelance writer and I'm working on this idea, you're likely to get shuffled off to the
Yeah, they don't take you serious.
they don't take you seriously. So it's wonderful to have access, and if that access is open and above board, that's fine. I've got no problem with it. But
Sure.
if it's a secret access and secret influences that are hidden, that the reader doesn't know exist for the journalist, then that's in a sense deceptive.
Well, it makes you kind of question how much of the information is factual and how much of it is twisted to, serve an agenda.
Mhm. And I think there has been a lot of propaganda in the American press, and some of it has been witting and unwitting. And I think that there have been publishers who have had elite contacts who believe that some stories should be told and some stories should not be told.
Yeah.
And that influences what we hear. I think it's incumbent upon every journalist who believes in the idea that journalism is important to fight against that attitude and to press forward to publish. I have a few stories in my own career of where there were efforts to stop me from reporting what I wanted to report on and what I thought was important to report on. And in some cases, it caused major disruption in my life. That's the reason I left my home state in Indiana, was because I was trying to report on political corruption. And I was being discouraged from inside the newspaper. And in fact, efforts were made to work against me in a very difficult national story involving political corruption.
Yeah, that's
So
I used disheartening before, but it kind of is, just as a regular person that relies on sources, of news to kind of understand what's happening in your local government, your country, the world. It's kind of upsetting to
it
think
is.
that you may be getting a skewed view, if it's even accurate at all.
Yeah. Well, that there are many things that people want from journalists, and regardless of an individual's skill at writing or their actual skill in reporting, the most important thing is for them to be independent and
Yes.
to be truthful. And that independence is something we just can't um, sometimes can't verify. So when questions like this come up, when there are questions about what has happened in the past where journalists are used as sources of information for intelligence purposes or those things, it endangers all journalists for that situation to exist. And when congressional hearings were held in the 70s about these very issues, that was what was talked about.
Yeah.
You read in the New York Times that the idea of using journalists for intelligence purposes put all journalists at risk. Yet the New York Times management was very aware of the kinds of intelligence operations that were going on within the country.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So the book is The Manchurian Journalist, which I'm assuming is taking the name from Manchurian Candidate, which was a movie about mind control. So
yes,
I'm
yeah,
guessing that's where that came from.
that's exactly where that came from. And that book was made into a couple of famous movies. One with Denzel Washington
Yeah.
most recently, and earlier with Frank Sinatra. And it wasn't trying to convey the idea that Lawrence Wright was brainwashed as the, Manchurian Candidate proposes, but it involves what we think we know and what we may not know and what we can trust. So a Manchurian journalist is, I guess, in concept, someone who has loyalties that are not clear when we need to know where our journalist's loyalties are.
That's right. That's right. So last question I have for this book, and then we'll move on to the one that's coming up. Um, if our journalism is compromised, and we all think, no matter which side you're on, I think we all agree that it's compromised. We just may not agree on which side, when it's probably both. But how do we get back to the point where journalists are operating kind of freely and independently so that we can trust what we're actually getting? Or can we get back to that?
I think we can actually. I mean, I see programs around the country where people in journalism schools are getting grants to do investigative projects,
Yeah.
and some good work comes out of there. I think we need to re-examine the institution of journalism and the opportunities for journalism to be about journalism and not about profit. So
Right.
much of what happened within the construct of newspapers and their survival had to do with the bottom line in corporate journalism as it expanded. What about support for local nonprofit organizations that recreate the kind of newsrooms that we once had, where journalists are independent, where they can report and not be fearful about, whether they're treading on someone's toes, but are only need to be fearful of how accurate they are, and if they are inaccurate, not being able to participate in this kind of activity. That's I think we could explore those ideas. I think we could find a mechanism to support journalism in a way that results in something that we can depend on, that we find credible.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, that's well said. So the book that you're getting ready to put out, when does it come out?
Well, actually, the Street Talk
Yeah, Street Talk.
it's out now. It actually, ironically, though different publishers, came out on the same day as the
Oh,
Manchurian.
okay. Yeah, I was thinking it was coming out next month, but okay, so it's out now. So it's Street Talk, The Great Flood, and Other Stories Examining River City. So you said that encompasses some of your earlier work from back in the 80s and different decades. So tell me a little bit about that. What's the book cover?
Well, the book is actually the result of my daughter's initiative, who has heard the stories for many
Good for
years,
her.
this and that, and she said you should put together a collection, and she made me cough up the boxes of old yellowed newspaper clips, and she picked out some things. The Pulitzer material is in there from the coverage of the flood in 1982. It was a staff award for the Fort Wayne News Sentinel. I took a primary reporting role and did front page pieces, and I one of those pieces, a column I did about the quiet in the city at midnight in the middle of the flood, was picked up by a college textbook on journalism and best of Pulitzer Prize news writing, and
I mean, that's
illustrated.
going to feel pretty good that you're in some college textbooks. That's pretty cool.
It was kind of cool, and interestingly, nobody contacted me about that when they put that together. They conducted that discussion with the editors, and another reporter had told me that she had read a column of mine in a textbook, and so I happened to be in New York City. I went down to the New York Public Library and started, with their help, researching that, and they found the book and brought it up in the little elevator, and I sat there and saw it for the first time in the New York Public Library. But the thing that I enjoyed more than anything else was that column was sandwiched next to one by Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent in World War II, who
Yep.
was killed in the Pacific. Well, he grew up in Newcastle, Indiana, which is about 30 miles from my hometown, and was one of my heroes in journalism. I read his books when I was younger, and I thought, man, that's the way to write, you know. And so it was kind of interesting to see that column next to one that he'd written.
Yeah, that's kind of great. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's to see some of your work next to someone that you looked up to or was a hero of yours. I mean, that's pretty special.
Yeah, it's got a special.
I was going to ask you who you admired journalist wise as you were early on in your career growing up. So Ernie Pyle's one. Was there any others?
Oh, there were a lot of them. I started reading Mark Twain when I was pretty young, and reading about his newspapering days, and of course I was attracted to some of the major fiction writers. But as I got a little older and got into college, I started reading Norman Mailer, and I had
Oh,
a
yeah.
teacher who did a class on new journalism, and I was really impressed by writers like Terry Southern, who wrote a magazine story about a twirling competition among majorettes down in Mississippi, and it was such a slight subject, but his description of how he set the scenes and using the literary techniques of fiction in a nonfiction story really attracted me, and I then started reading Jimmy Breslin out of New York, who was,
Yeah.
and that's probably what I patterned after mostly when I started writing my own column. Was, Breslin wrote about the little guy. He wrote about the guy down at the bar, and that's what I did too. I followed that idea, and that's what led me to a lot of really interesting stories in Fort Wayne. And it
I love
was,
that.
yeah.
What's it like having two books out at the same time that are really, they're both journalism but different,
They
and
they
what
are.
what kind of response are you getting one book compared to the other?
Well, I haven't actually gotten a whole lot of response as yet. As yet, I expected a little bit of negative response over the Manchurian journalist, and that might yet come. But I think the people that have seen Street Talk and have read it have been interested to see how I approach those things. I did approach journalism differently than a lot of reporters, and I as you look at Street Talk, you see that I'm describing often common scenes and common people in just their everyday lives, and there are some other things in there. Like I wrote about the attempted assassination of the civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, who was
Oh, right.
shot in Fort Wayne in 1980, and it, you know, I had the nickname in newsrooms frequently of Lucky Dan because I would I would show up at the right place at the right time, and that's another example of how I was kind of strangely on the fringe of things. The woman that was with Vernon Jordan on the night he was shot was someone I knew well, had been actually dating at the time, and so she became the mystery woman. She disappeared after the shooting, and nobody could find her, and
Cool.
so including me.
I was
And
gonna say,
so,
what was that like being, a boyfriend or someone
well,
out with her?
it got me called into the FBI. And the FBI had to clear me as a suspect. So they did an interview with me about, the where I was and what I was doing and how I knew Martha Coleman,
Wow.
the woman he was with, and all that. And then I wrote about that. And I wrote a column about that FBI interview. I think it's in the book. And at the end, the FBI agent said, "Well, and you're a reporter. Is there anything we failed to ask you?" And I said, "Well, you didn't ask me if I did it," which I thought might have been a central question. But but
Did
the
they laugh or did they like, hmm?
I think they laughed.
Yeah.
But I did eventually find Martha Coleman, and the national news was all over the place, and everybody was trying to find her. And I finally got the interview with her and published it, and then all the national media went home after
Yeah.
that. So once again, it was, working the street out there to try to get a word to her where she was in hiding. And that's how, that's how I found her. And
That's amazing. And what a great career you've had, and just the different where the different stories have taken you. I know that a lot of times that's not where you expect to end up, but it's just kind of where the story goes.
yeah, well, I chased a lot of controversy, and I'm working on a documentary film now on a series of cold case crimes in Speedway, Indiana in 1978. And one of them, there was a murder of an inexplicable murder of a grandmother in her garage. There was a series of bombings that started a few weeks later that lasted for 8 days. And then 4 kids were kidnapped out of a fast food restaurant and found murdered in the woods 30 miles away, all in the space of about 6 months. And the murder of these, it's known as the Burger Chef murders. This case has been high profile for 40 years, more than 40 years, and never been solved. And there have been a lot of theories. There was just a film that was made about this case, of which I participated in a minor way until I realized it wasn't going to be investigative, but more drama. But the case,
That would make a pretty good podcast.
it probably would. Yeah. But I've gone back and re-examined this case, and this one of the central figures in it is a man who was convicted of the bombings. He was known as the Speedway Bomber. His name's Brett Kimberlin, and he became well known. There was a book written about him called Citizen K, and he was sent to prison for these bombings. He was a marijuana smuggler at the time, a very young marijuana smuggler,
Yeah.
in his early 20s, and
That's not
but
usually your typical bombing suspect.
yeah, but he got caught up in national politics when he told NPR that he sold pot to Dan Quayle when Dan
Oh,
Quayle was in law school, and so he got kind of high profile, and things happened. But I've investigated his case for some years, and I recently found a narcotics officer who was also a hypnotist that hypnotized witnesses in Kimberlin's trial. And he told me that Kimberlin had had ineffective assistance of counsel because his lawyer never discovered the fact that this witness, the man who hypnotized these other witnesses, had a cousin who was on the jury.
oh,
And they never disclosed to the court nor anyone else that there was a relation. It purely prohibited. She would have been removed from the jury if it had been known.
yeah, of
They
course.
kept it secret for all these years. Well, he wound up giving an affidavit to the Justice Department verifying what he had told me at one point. And it was then I began to look at corruption involving the Kimberlin case. I know for a fact that he was wrongfully convicted. He may well have been entirely innocent, as he's always claimed. And the 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 aura of police corruption that surrounded all of these events in Indianapolis went into the FBI, went into the local police, into narcotics. Basically, they were controlling organized crime in Indianapolis through police agencies that were allowing certain people to operate and others to not. And we're exploring the idea in this documentary film that Kimberlin was targeted as a scapegoat.
When can we expect that to be out?
We're hoping to get that out to streamers for sale sometime in September. We're working with a Emmy-winning animation crew down in Austin who are putting together some realistic animation for help tell the history of the story. We have an excellent story here, and we have some revelations that will come about these cases and why they've never been solved. And I think it'll be a powerful story when we get
Do
it done.
you ever fear for your own safety with some of these stories? Because it seems like there's people out there that might not want that stuff to come out.
I was investigating a plot to commit murder, and the police were not apprised of it yet. But I was talking with the hitman. That story is in the Street Talk book. And at that time, friends advised me, including a Marine captain who I knew, to take steps to protect myself.
Yeah.
You know, I never was comfortable carrying a firearm. I never really considered that, though. I'm not anti-firearm by any means. I hunted when I was a kid. I grew up around them, whatever. But there was a case in Indianapolis where, as I was investigating this national political corruption, I had an interview with a private investigator on an unrelated case, and I picked him up in my car, and we were driving, and he said, "I know where you live, by the way." I said, "Really?" I lived in a little farmhouse outside Indianapolis with a lot of open farm fields around. And he said, "Yeah." I said, "How do you know where I live?" He said, "Because I was hired to keep an eye on you with some other private investigators. We laid on the railroad tracks with binoculars and watched who came and went from your house." I had my house swept for bugs at the time by a state police investigator that I knew well. And there have always been those questions, but I've never really felt threatened. I've never felt fearful about it. I don't think it does you any good. I I have taught my kids since I covered Columbine how to be watchful.
Right.
I've taken steps so that they understand that there are certain things to look for, and I know what they are.
That's right.
And so I am mindful about things, but I can't say that I've ever been fearful. I've had a lot of confrontations. I was held hostage by a source that I was talking to,
Really?
an interview with. He was a fugitive from the law, and he had a story he wanted to tell. And I met with him in an apartment, and I was there longer than I thought I would be, and he had gone off to the restroom. And so I picked up the phone and called my girlfriend to tell her I wouldn't be able to meet her for lunch. And when I hung up the phone and turned around, he had a 22 caliber rifle leveled at my chest. He said, "You just called the cops." I said, "No, I called my girlfriend." But we sat down and I did the interview at gunpoint for a good hour. And finally, when the cops didn't show up, he set the gun down and he said, "I guess I was wrong."
You couldn't just show him the number you called or
Well,
call her back.
those were the days of dial phones, in the electronics. But I negotiated for hostages on death row at one time, and those kinds of things are stressful, and there are you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But there was always something of an adrenaline rush for me in doing these kinds of things and being involved in these sorts of investigations. And I've been with cops in high speed chases. I've just done a lot of really interesting things, all for the idea of knowing what it was like so I could write about it.
That's amazing. And Dan, thank you so much for taking some time. There's so much. I feel like we could talk all night. You have to come back when the documentary gets ready to come out. You got to come back and talk to us some more.
I'd love to. That'd be great. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been terrific. So you've got the Manchurian Journalist and Street Talk both out right now. I'm assuming that we can find those everywhere: Amazon, bookstores, Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble, those kind of places. Yeah, you can find them online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered anything, but anything else that you're working on that we can keep an eye out for?
Well, I'm working on a book about the Chicago mob
Really?
and the myth of Al Capone.
I would be very interested in that because there really is a myth about him, and there's been so much written about him, and he's still kind of mysterious.
Well, kind of mysterious, but you know what? The my sources on this story were people actually involved in the Chicago mob, and one of them was Jimmy Hoffa's liaison to the Chicago, who became something of a mentor of mine, and he taught me a lot of things about how to take care of yourself in the world.
Yeah.
And he also told me that he was always disturbed by the fact that Al Capone was painted as the guy who ran the Chicago mob because that made the mob sound like it was Italian. And
Right.
the Chicago mob was never Italian. It was multi-ethnic, Irish, Jewish, you name it. There were all kinds of elements in the Chicago organization. So he not only told me that Al Capone didn't run the Chicago mob, he introduced me to the son of the man who did run the Chicago mob. And I spent hours with him talking about his father and the way things really were in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s.
Oh, that sounds incredible. When do you expect to finish that one?
Well, I've finished writing the book. I'm doing the manuscript, getting it typed because I wrote the book in longhand.
Oh,
And so I should have that finished soon and get my footnotes in place, and I'm ready for a publisher. So.
awesome. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, Dan, one last thing before I let you go. Where can we find you on social media?
Well, you can't. I've never been on Twitter. I've never been on any of the social media.
It surprises me that you haven't been on at least Twitter, even though there's so many negatives with that. But just so many journalists are on there.
Yeah, and maybe I should consider that after Lawrence Wright's Twitter example. I think I stayed away. But and I don't have a website, which I should have. But I'm working on those.
You should have a website. Maybe that daughter that convinced you to write the book.
That's right. Maybe she can guide me in that direction.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. And please do anytime come back. Just let me know when you're ready. We'll bring you back on.
I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it. So I'll look forward to that.
Yes, sir. Okay, hold on one second. Dan Luzadder, hope you enjoyed that. What a talented, interesting gentleman, and just an absolutely terrific journalist. The type of journalist that we don't have enough of these days, and I hope that Dan's correct that it's a fixable problem. I grew up with my favorite journalists, both locally and nationally. But I don't really have those anymore, and I think that's a shame. And part of it is we've lost that journalistic presence, not just in newspapers, but on the local networks. We just don't have that anymore. So I hope we can get back to that. I hope that you check out both of these books, The Manchurian Journalist, which is kind of a scary book because of what it is outlined and the implications that come with it. I know I was telling Dan offline, I got to get my copies of his books and get them read because I'm so interested in the topic. But it also terrifies me because it's confirming a lot of things that a lot of us have suspected and have worried about for years. So interested in reading that one. Manchurian journalist Lawrence Wright, the CIA and the corruption of American journalism. Make sure you check that one out. And then Street Talk, the Great Flood and Other Stories from River City, which details a lot of his investigative journalism that he did through the 80s, 90s, probably the 70s as well, including the one he got the Pulitzer for. So definitely check that one out as well. I think, honestly, I probably could have done 2 different interviews on one on each book because they're both so interesting. I can't wait to read both of them. And then the documentary that's coming out, hopefully we'll see something on it later in the year, early next year. But we're a country that loves true crime. We love cold cases. Very interested in that. And I meant that it would make a really good podcast. Not that I was hinting that, if he wants some help with the podcast on that, but I kind of was. That would be awesome. That's a really good story. Definitely a documentary that I'll check out. We love our documentaries. Hope you guys enjoyed that. If you're finding us for the first time, I'm so happy that you're here. There's a couple easy ways that you can support us if you're so inclined, and we'd love that. Our YouTube channel is MeisterCon Pod. If you go there, please subscribe. It's free, really helps us out. Our website is meistercon.com. You can find, today we put out episode 812. You can find all of those audio and video versions on our website, meistercon.com. I would put our guest list up against anybody, any talk show, any podcast, anybody. We have been blessed with the, and don't get me wrong, it's taken a lot of hard work, but the guests that we've had on the show, I'm so proud of them, and Dan fits right in there, whether your interests are in entertainment, music, politics, with writers, with books, magazines, whatever your interest is. I guarantee we've covered it. So please check that out, meistercon.com. Thank you guys so much. Until next time. Bye, everybody.